Right. So in the previous tutorial, I think we have implemented our sword blueprint. So currently I can equip the sword and I can move within the level. So similarly, I think we have unarmed pistol, rifle and sword that has been implemented. But currently I am switching the weapons by simply pressing the keyboard keys like 1, 2, 3 and 4. Because I think these are some of the debug keys that I implemented at our character player blueprint. So here you can see these are the current inputs that I've been integrated uh, for our weapon switching. But instead of hard coding our weapons for each keyboard key, I think it's nice to have sort of like a weapon wheel weapon switching like we usually see in other third person shooter games. So let's implement that feature. Okay, right. So in order to get started with, we need one input that consumes mouse wheel. So currently I'm using this enhanced input system, and by default it has this IA look, IA move, and additionally I added these sort of inputs. So similarly, let's add a new input action to our input mapping context. So we have this stuff, and additionally we need another record. Right, let me quickly see. Okay, so let's go to the action, and I'll create a new folder called weapon, because these input actions that is dedicated for weapon transitions and whatever the interactions that it has. So I'll group those input actions within this directory, right? Because later on we are going to have multiple different input actions. So in order to distinguish in between whatever the actions that we have, it's nice to have this sort of organization. Right. And there I'll create a new input action. I'll call it as IA inc weapon slot. Basically this stands for increment weapon slot, right? And I'll open it up, and the default configurations would be fine. Okay? So this should be a digital bool, and rest of the configurations let's keep as it is. And similarly I'll duplicate this one, and instead of increment we need another one for decrement. So let's call it as deck weapon slot. So we have these two, and now let's go to our input mapping context and add these two. So first we need IA increment weapon slot, and we need to bind a specific input action or keyboard or mouse input mapping. So I will use mouse wheel up as the incremented weapon slot. And similarly, let's add decrement weapon slot, and let's add mouse wheel down. Okay, so once you saved, it will give these warnings. That would be fine, because by default you must provide a name, but currently I haven't given any names, so just ignore that warning, and yeah, you're good to go. Right, so let's go to the player base again, and let's call that inc weapon slot action here, and for now I will simply add a print statement called maybe inc, and similarly we need decrement weapon slot, and I'll add a debug print string called DEC. Maybe I'll give it a red color, and for this one I'll give it a green color. And now let's play test. So if I roll my mouse wheel up, you can see it printing ink, and if I roll my mouse wheel down, it will print DEC, right? Okay, and I can switch in between mouse wheel up and down as well. Okay, which means our inputs are consumed properly. Now we simply need to move this logic, or we need to modify this logic in order to keep up with these two inputs, right? So let's go to the weapon system blueprint component, and there I think we can implement set of new events. So currently we have use weapon to use a specific weapon based on the slot that we have been passed. And similarly, let's add new events to handle this increment slot and decrement slot. So I'll add a new custom event called increment slot, and another event for decrement slot. Okay, I don't need this tick event, so I'll remove it. Right, so first let's go with the increment slot part, and then later on let's implement the decrement slot. So first I have to get the weapon slots, and I need to check its length, and if the length is not equal to 1, which means there are multiple weapons that has been exist on the weapon slot, which means we can increment the slots. So if it is not equal to 1, right, then we can implement, because by default actually we will have at least one weapon slot at our inherited character, because unarmed is a weapon slot as well. So at least a specific character will have this unarmed weapon slot by default. So by design the default length would be 1. So if it is larger than 1, which means we have viable set of weapon slots that we can swap. Therefore let's get the current slot and increment it by 1, right? Because this is increment in the slots, and then we can use that incremented weapon, right? So this will work actually when we are incrementing up, but once we increment into the upmost weapon, which is the last weapon, this should go back, right? Which means it's sort of a round robin fashion weapon swap. But yeah, if first, in order to implement that, we need to decrement the current slot based on the value that we have. So let's first get the length of it, and -1, and then in order to decrement or go back to the first weapon, in order to round robin or go back to the initial weapon, we can check whether the current slot is the last weapon that we have been currently equipped. So if the current slot is length -1, which means the last index, then we are at the last slot. So they should go back to the original default slot, which is 0. So I'll add a select here, and if this is true it will go to 0, and if it is false it will keep incrementing the current slots, right? So we can use the weapon, right? And then let's go to the player base, and instead of this print statement I will use this weapon system convert to validated get, and let's use that increment slot function. Just for the debugging purposes I will add a print string here to show what is the current slot that we have been equipped. Okay, now if I move my mouse up, you can see 1 is visible of the print statement and the pistol is equipped. Similarly, 2 is the rifle, 3 is the sword, and 4 is again clamped back to 0, which is unarmed state, which means our round robin weapon incrementing slots works properly, right? So I can keep swap the weapons as the incremented slots, but here you can see, like for the decrement the logic is not there yet, yeah? So let's implement it as well. So I'm at here as the decrement slot. I think we can share the same logic that we have here, but this is decrementing, right? So decrementing comes with the other way around. So we have to first start with the length. Or is it other way around? No, we can start with current slot and we can decrement it by 1 and we can use the weapon, but this should go back to 0. So once it go back to 0 it should clamp again to the last weapon, right? So similarly that what we have been done here, it should be the opposite way. So basically in order to go to the last weapon, this is, let's get the length of these weapon slots and minus 1, which is the last index, and we can go to there. So how to determine that we are at the very first weapon? Well, it's simple. Let's get the current slot, and if it is equal to 0, which means we are at the initial default weapon, so let's select a specific integer. So this is, if this is true, then we should go to a last weapon. If it is not true, then we keep decrementing it. Okay, right. And this wire seems bit unorganized, so just to get rid of it I can get the weapon slot, and instead of this -1 I think there is a dedicated function called last index. So this will simply return the last valid index of the array, right? So we can directly get rid of this one and attach it to here. Similarly, we can get rid of this one, attach it to here. So it would be much more organized, right? And for that as well, I will add this print statement, compile and save. Let's go to the player base and I can get rid of this one, and let's add decrement slot function. If I play it now, And if I start decrementing it, now you can see it start with the sword, which is the third index, and the second is rifle, and the first is pistol, and the 0 is unarmed. And if I press the mouse wheel down again, it again go back to the sword, right? So decrementing also work, and incrementing also work, right? So if I had the unarmed state, and if I incremented 1, 2, 3, right? And if I decremented from the unarmed state, it's 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay. So our weapon sub basically works now. And I can get rid of this print statement. And maybe I can comment these two stuffs as well. So this one is for incrementing weapon slots. And this one is for decrementing weapon slots. Okay. Compile and save. And let's play test it again. Okay. Everything works properly. Great. Right. So that's how we can add the weapon slot features. So therefore, I can get rid of these manual weapon switches. I just added those stuff just for the debugging purposes. So since we now we have a proper implementation, we can get rid of it. And I'll come in this stuff as well called weapon. Right. Okay. So that's how we add weapon transition for our weapon slots. And in the next tutorial, let's see how we can add more features, maybe like to visualizing these weapons that we currently equip in the HUD or things like that. I'll see you there. Thank you.